weeks is um, seeing what we're looking at for this week. Again, if you haven't gone on the reading quiz, it should have been done by today. If for some reason it didn't happen, please email me and let me know. We could work something out. I did put up a couple of resources here. One of them, um, we'll talk through this today with Leviticus, but this website offers a lot of really good resources specifically. And I'll go ahead and click on it so you guys can see them related to the book of Leviticus. And so there's specific dates that are assigned to it, not that you necessarily need to keep in with the dates. And again, devotionals designed to supplement, not replace your Bible reading. And so you'll see here, and I'll go through these. I'll go through one for next week specifically when we talk about Day of Atonement. But you'll see here connections within Leviticus and especially contemporary application for us here, especially for us as followers of Jesus. And um, so you see here that God makes for allowances for the poor by not only accepting a costly bull as an olah or a sacrifice, but also an inexpensive bird. In this way, God sets up a kind of sliding scale pricing program that requires payment on a what you can afford basis. Because God first looks at the heart, he makes allowances for everyone to come and worship him regardless of economic status. By being completely set apart for God on the altar, how might the olah point to Yeshua, Jesus? How might this burnt sacrifice or the sacrifice be point to Yeshua? And how can you be like an olah or sacrifice? Along with the meat of the olah, there was also usually bread required part of worship. And so, there's just a lot of background that's provided and a lot of original language that is taken from the Hebrew that helps us to understand what's going on in sacrificial system in Leviticus. And so again, there's just a lot of really good resources there for you to take a look at if you're interested. But even if you're not, it's just, I think it's really cool just to take a look at some of the cultural elements that are there and some of the contemporary application for us. Week 9 next week, a little bit of a lighter week. These readings are a little bit longer, so you're going to want to take a look at those. Worksheet 9 is pretty simple. I believe there's 2 questions on there. But you're going to want to give yourself a good amount of time because these readings are a little bit longer here. And then spring break. So that's what's coming for these next couple weeks. Are there any questions, comments, concerns? Questions, comments, concerns? Concerned. What are you concerned about, Brian? Just kidding. All right. Let me see. Do we have a midterm? No, we do not have a midterm. So there you go. Yeah, no midterm for this class. We'd have a final, but again, we'll work through that when we get there. And a lot of the midterm will be questions taken from your quizzes and also from different lectures and readings and stuff. But I'll make sure you guys are well prepared for that. But yeah, no midterm. Just these dang worksheets you still got to work through. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, bless your soul, Professor. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. You're welcome. Is that a little teardrop, Joseph? Brought a tear to your eye. Just a little one? All right. I'll take what I can get. All right. So you'll see this up on Moodle, Pentateuch, our lecture for this afternoon. Little birdie there is an offering. You guys I had read a little bit from the devotional talking about the olah or the sacrifice. You see a pigeon there that was could be offered if somebody didn't have the economic means to be able to afford offering a bull, because it would have meant either offering an animal or lose their livelihood or be a threat to it. They were allowed to bring 2 birds, one of which a pigeon, which was really inexpensive, relatively inexpensive. And so what we're going to talk about today, we're going to finish out Sinai in Exodus, retracing some of the story that we've talked about so far, and then intro to Leviticus. So this is where we're going for today. What I had talked about last class, more specifically, we had talked about the golden calf episode, in the episode with the golden calf, is that it had ended pretty abruptly, mostly because there was so much we had to get through. But there's a few things within the golden calf episode that I do want to kind of rehearse for us as we approach talking about Leviticus. One of them being that in this golden calf episode, that this kind of disobedience of the first law, that you will have no other gods before me. Regarding, again, the improper worship of Yahweh, that it was worship that demanded a kind of image or a physical shape. And I had brought up idolatry last week under a certain kind of condition, that idolatry is not another, isn't the worship of another God. That idolatry as the worship of anything else other than God. Again, idolatry isn't just the worship of another God, but anything else that isn't God. And so again, that as Aaron forms this gold and it pops out, so happens to pop out of the fire as a golden calf, that the proclamation isn't here worship Baal, worship Ashtoreth, worship Ra, worship Molech, but rather, hey, these calves are Yahweh. These golden calves are the ones that brought you out of the land of Egypt. And that kind of ascription, that this representation is in fact Yahweh. So again, which we brought up, that was problematic because of the fact that God has made us reflections of himself. That's where the word image of God comes from in Genesis. And so the kind of physical representation that was declined by God has been made manifest again in the presence of human beings. And even more so when we talk about tabernacle, a continued way of how God reveals himself. That the way that Israel wanders from is the covenant code that is made by God in Israel. Again, the Sinai Mosaic covenant. You have the tradition that associates Levites with violence, again, their zeal associated with dedication. And a couple notes on the golden calf, that it was in Canaanite religion, that you have that association between the calf and Baal, son of El, represented by a bull. And so before we talk about tabernacle, there are a few things that we need to highlight specifically in regards to the relationship that is shared between Yahweh and the people. That, again, this is why I redefine so often that Torah doesn't just mean law, but rather teaching, and that the relational components that are inherent to teaching that often get missed when we just use the kind of cold legal word law. But that there's specific relational elements that we need to see in the covenant between God and Israel that isn't just purely legal, but also relational. And so I'm going to go ahead and read through this passage because there's a few things that I do want to highlight for us here. In Exodus 33, that on the third new moon after the Israelites had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day Moses said to the Lord, "See, you have said to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now, if I have found favor in your sight, show me your ways that I may know you and find favor in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people." He said, this is Yahweh, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." But Moses said to him, "If your presence will not go, do not carry us up from here. For how shall it be known that if I have found favor in your sight, I and your people, unless you go with us? In this way we shall be distinct, or holy, set apart, I and your people from every people on the face of the earth." And the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you have asked for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name." Moses said, "Show me your glory, I pray." And he said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you. I will proclaim before you the name of the Lord, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and on whom I will show mercy, on whom I will show mercy." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for no one shall see me and live." And he continued, "See, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock, and while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by." Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. And so there's a couple things happening here that I want for us to recognize. Like, one of them is this unique link between Moses and Yahweh. Between Moses and Yahweh, that there's something happening here within the text where there's a kind of privilege afforded to Moses that isn't given to the rest of Israel, specifically in this kind of revealing of one's face or presence, that in Hebrew, pani could mean face or presence. So while we have phrases like this that you cannot see God's face and live, but yet Moses is speaking to God face to face, that there could be a couple of ways of interpreting it. One is that either Moses is having a kind of face to face conversation and indicating a kind of intimacy, that it's just them two intimate with one another, or that it's presence to presence, that they're kind of in the same space while not necessarily face to face. Kind of how it's just like right now, that even though we have a kind of a mediated by technology presence together, we are somewhat in each other's presence. And so again, it's even though it's mediated, that there is a kind of presence that's being shared by two parties. And to also recognize this emphasis on your people, your people, your people, your people. That these intimate requests that Moses makes, one is of presence for God to be with the people, another one for Yahweh, or for Moses to see Yahweh's glory. Again, to see Yahweh as he is, this kind of intimate request that Moses has of Yahweh, which demands this kind of favorable response from Yahweh. And again, this coming after what's happened between the Israelites and the people and Yahweh, between the golden calf episode. So again, this distinctive mark between an individual who has this demonstration of committed faithfulness set in the context, the larger context of people who are unfaithful. And this kind of favor that is demonstrated to those who return committed faithfulness or covenant faithfulness, and Yahweh's response to them. And we saw this in part with Adam. We saw this with Noah. We saw this with Abraham. We see it in part with Isaac and Jacob. And here we see it again with Moses. That's set again against the context of infidelity, that you have these individuals that demonstrate a kind of covenant commitment and faithfulness to Yahweh that Yahweh sees favorable. And out of this comes a kind of new start indicated by the word bara, which is the same word that is used in Genesis 1, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That God created is God bara, or God started the heavens and the earth. So this kind of indication of a new openness that God has in covenanting with Israel once again. And you notice that part of it that comes up within the text, and that I want to point us towards. I have written there, your people, your problem. Again, this nation is your people. Those kids that were wandering around making a golden calf, engaging in promiscuous activity and calling it worship rituals, that's your people. Them's yours. I and your people. I and your people. Again, this kind of confrontational element that Moses jumps on in order to remind God about these kinds of things, this kind of boldness that Moses has with Yahweh, that again serves as an encouragement for us in the ways that not only do we pray, but we participate in the world. There's a few things that are intended by the Exodus event, and then later on through experiencing encounters with Yahweh. That experience of the deity prompts remembrance. And again, I had talked about how with the plagues and how Passover and the plagues are interconnected, that a kind of intervention of a deity prompts an event that is revealed the character of the deity. That again, but because God has redeemed and rescued us in the Exodus, we understand God to be Redeemer and Savior. Again, not necessarily in the way we understand salvation now as being saved from sin and death, but again, saving from the hand of the Egyptians, from oppression. That is the intervention of the deity that reveals the character of the deity. And that's what's to be reflected on. Is what does the act of the deity reflect about their character? And that's the point of remembrance. But that remembrance also results in praise and in congregational worship. That remembrance is meant to be a springboard rather than a resting place. The remembrance is to prompt worshipful responses to the deity. And for here, our cases, it's to Yahweh. And that congregational worship should cultivate a devotion that expresses itself through obedience. That yes, worship is meant to form us into more obedient kinds of creatures. That obedience reflects loyalty, allegiance of the heart. It's not just an oratory commitment. It's not just a spoken commitment, but rather one that is motivated by the internal desire to demonstrate committed faithfulness and obedience. Again, it's a lot like relationships. You say if you love somebody, then you go behind their backs, you cheat on them, you lie to them, you steal from them, you go do all these things. It's just kind of like, oh, but I love you. But I love you. Again, the kind of whole thing, the actions speak louder than words. That we understand the heart of what that's meaning is that we understand that at the root of actions is a certain kind of internal motivation. That what we say and what we do, that if they're not lined up, they create a kind of cognitive dissonance that is difficult for us to make understandable. And so again, it's not just obedience for obedience sake or behavioral modification, but rather having an internal motivation of love, of generosity, of wanting to reflect back to God in worshipful response what he's done for his people. And so again, but this is oftentimes what gets characterized as legalism in the Old Testament, that the Old Testament Torah or law is all about just keeping rules. It's all about behavioral motivation. No. Internal motivation is at the heart, again, of what it means to love God with all one's heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so again, that we need to remember this, especially when we get to when you take kings and prophets and you take gospels, it's important to remember these kinds of things, especially with Jesus' interactions with the Pharisees and what Jesus does to go back to the heart of Torah rather than just its outward maintenance in order to preserve the people from breaking actual Torah. And what Jesus does to get here. That a kind of loyalty, allegiance, a heartfelt motivation of keeping the law, which is why Jesus is always ramping up so many of the laws that were there. That you've heard it said that if you commit adultery, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you, if you look at a woman or a man and lust after them, you committed adultery in your heart. That again, Jesus' concern for the internal motivation is not just purely drummed up in the New Testament, but again, it comes from a kind of reading here. That allegiance, loyalty is demonstrated in this heartfelt commitment, not just one motivated to keep external behavioral mannerisms. Why? One of them, and the biggest one, is because of God's character and the reflection of God's character and desire to be with and among his people. And so Exodus 35 through 40, often reading that we love to get through and love to dig in when we're doing devotionals and we're trying to think of where should I read in the Bible today. We're reading about tabernacle, how to build it, put it together. But a couple of things that I do want for us to consider. One of them, it's God making good on his promise to be with the people. Because as we talked about, Abrahamic covenant, dust off the brain cells, go back a few weeks. What was the heart of Abrahamic covenant? We had drummed it up in 3 P's. Prophets, pizza, partita. 3 P's.
Is it people, place, and presence?
Attaboy. There you go. There we go. People, descendants, bunch of babies running around for Abraham. Place, God giving to Abraham and his descendants a place, the land of Canaan, the promised land, and presence. God being God to Abraham's descendants and the people being with him. So again, God making good on this promise to Abraham. And it's going to be important to bring up because you may have an exercise coming up here soon that's going to ask you to kind of rehearse some of these details and some of the issues that come up as a result of Genesis 3. And then understand obedience as internal motivation that has outward demonstration of loyalty or devotion. And especially I want for us to understand this kind of internal motivation, because if we don't have a hold of that, it's going to be very difficult to understand why people like Abraham are such significant characters, why people like Moses are significant characters, and why it's so disturbing in places like Genesis 3 and then Genesis 6 when we see of disloyalty, disobedience at work. And again, I want us to grab a hold of that language of disloyalty, not just of disobedience or rebellion, though that's really good and important for us to use and utilize, but also to, again, to have unfaithfulness as a part of our vocabulary, disloyalty as a part of our vocabulary. Because again, it ties it all back into the context of covenant and relationship. And as we're talking about covenant and relationship, as we talk about tabernacle, one of the things Walter Brueggemann, great theologian, one of my favorites, says that it is not the people's preparedness that causes God to dwell among them. It's not that they're ready, they got all cleaned up, they finally got all the 10 commandments figured out, the sin is out of the place, they finally got right. No, but rather God's dwelling in their midst is a matter of the divine initiative and promise, that the reason why God comes close to the people isn't because they're ready, but rather God chooses to do so. Sounds a lot like gospel. Wally B. Love that guy. Can you repeat the 3 P's, how to use the bathroom? You gotta, people, place, and presence. People, place, and presence. That's essentially the heart of Abrahamic covenant. Again, the promise of descendants, the promise of a place, Canaan, the land of Canaan, and then the promise of God's presence. I will be God to them and they will be my people. There you go. Johnny's taking notes for everybody. So tabernacle. So you'll note here, tabernacle, the tent on the outside, gate facing the east and the west, north, south. Placed around here, you will have the tribes, and I'll have another slide for that for when we get there in Numbers, because this will become a movable tent. So you have the bronze altar here for offerings, basin of water to wash their hands before they go in, little courtyard here before, the kind of church foyer right here. And you'll notice the different articles that are here, but to do note the big place is the holy place here, and then the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, which holds the 2 tablets with the 10 Commandments on them. Tabernacle is about 14 meters long, which is, believe, like something like 4 meters, about 3-ish feet or so. So looking about at 40 feet here. Again, these are just rough estimates. It's about 12 feet high, 12 feet wide. So again, this is no small space to be in. And this thing's movable. And this is the place, again, which serves as the representation of God dwelling with, in, and among the people. Well, not so much in, but with and among the people. And so again, you'll have 3 to the south, 3 tribes specifically to the south, 3 tribes to the west, 3 tribes to the north and 3 tribes to the east, and God at the center of the camp. And yes, it'll form a cross, but it could also form an X, depending on how you look at it. But again, the point here in seeing these specific details is how God has decided once again, to make his dwelling among the people. And you'll notice some of the elements here, like this golden lampstand. If you were to look at it, it's meant to look like a tree. What other place in the Bible do we find a tree that it's a point of significance?
Was Moses a bush?
Moses in the burning bush, that's one. But go back a little further.
Oh, the tree of knowledge.
There you
Good on
go.
you.
Yep. Where trees factor very prominently. Again, this, if we can think of it this way, is kind of a mini Eden. A mini Eden, a movable Eden of a meeting place where God is meeting with the people. And so you guys will have taken on your quiz what the tabernacle is for, and to understand tabernacle as the body of God. And I talked about that last class. Where tabernacle serves both as a presence, symbol of presence, and vehicle for divine immanence, where God's come close, where God's present as the Holy One, and how God moves into Israel's space. And again, a lot of this will prompt our discussion on Leviticus. Because so much of Leviticus's concerns is about how do we maintain this? How do we act when God has come close? That the fact that God is holy doesn't, again, I've talked about holiness before, and what have I defined holiness as? You might see this
Isn't
on
it
a quiz soon.
like a separateness or like sacred or separate from, I don't know.
Yeah, almost the opposite. Almost the opposite. It's a lot more normal than we think. How have I defined holiness? And I kept repeating it so we kind of get it in our heads. So one of the things I want you guys write down, get it tattooed on your necks, whatever you got to do to have it memorized, is holiness as distinctiveness or uniqueness, not separate from, but in the midst of. In the midst of. That both God as Holy One isn't just separate off in heaven, but also present among the people. Distinct, unique. Yeah, he's other than, but he's still within the context of being among the people. Yeah, he's something different, something unique, but again, within the context of being amongst the people. That he's not, with the way Albert Einstein described God, as just kind of a distant landlord, just off there chilling in heaven. But no, he's amongst, around, he's in the mix, but as distinct, as unique. And sometimes holiness, and I do have to make this caveat, sometimes holiness will be described as a kind of moral uprightness, a kind of moral standard that must be achieved. But more often than not, that's a kind of subset to uniqueness. It doesn't stand alone on its own. That again, if you want to think of it this way, that God being present as Holy One means that God's just a different dude, just a different cat. Israel being holy means that they're just different. They're just on another level. Distinct, different. It's like Steph Curry at that 3-point contest last night. He's just different. He's just different. And if you didn't see it, once he made one in, it was game over. Just different. And so let me go through. You know what? We'll go ahead and take our break early because we have a bit to talk through with Leviticus. Are there any questions, comments, concerns so far? I know a lot of this was review, but we had to again tie a bow on Exodus and talk through some of this. But are there any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts? All right, so let's go ahead. We'll take. Let me think. I think either way we'll end up getting out of class early today, which is always a good sign. Let's go ahead and take a 20-minute break, and then we'll get back. We'll get back together, talk about what I want you guys to start thinking through before you guys jump on your break, because you could do got 20 minutes. Is what we're going to be doing when you guys get back. Looking at in these broad strokes, covering the main characters and plot points. Tell me the story of the Pentateuch so far in 8 to 12 sentences. So be sure to cover the main parts of Genesis 1 through 3, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Exodus. Be sure to cover the main problem that God addresses. Again, think Genesis 3 and Genesis 6. And then think back, what is God's original intention in Genesis and how does he work to get that back? And so again, so go ahead. Again, take your 20-minute break. But do be thinking through this as this is the next thing we're going to be working on in class. So, all right, you guys have any questions, comments, concerns? I'll be here. See you guys in 20-ish minutes. We're going to be doing for this next section. So you'll see it over on Moodle. So on you guys' laptops, you want to open up Moodle week 8. Moodle week 8. If you're on your phone, this will be a little trickier to do, but still very possible. I know if you have to get off of the screen or you have to turn off your camera, that's fine. But what I want you to do is you'll see this on Moodle. It says in broad strokes, and I had mentioned these guys before. Mentioned this that in broad strokes, covering the main characters and plot points you have talked about. Tell me the story of the Pentateuch so far in paragraph of 8 to 12 sentences. If it's less, don't worry about it. If it's more, don't worry about it. But again, 8 to 12 is kind of a good guide to fill in some of the, and to get to the point of the story. So you're going to want to make sure you cover the first parts of the main parts of Genesis 1 through 3, and especially 3 as poses the problem, and especially 6. Noah, Abraham, Moses, and the Exodus. And so again, thus far, what's the story? Make sure you cover the main problem that comes up, especially in Genesis 3 and then in Genesis 6. Exodus 32 poses a different kind of problem, but still a problem nonetheless. And then how does God address the problem? How God does it. Okay. And then think again, God's original intention in Genesis and how does he work to get that back? So I'll go ahead and share that with you guys. Again, God being present with his people in a place. God being present with his people in a specific place. So again, God's original intention in Genesis, God being present with his people in a place. And then how does God work to get that back? So far in Pentateuch, how has he worked to do that? And so let me go ahead and do this. So you'll see, again, if you go over here to Moodle, week 8, your laptops or on your phones or whatever you're using, every kind of device, a tablet, go to journal exercise, the story so far. Journal exercise, the story so far. And again, you'll see the same things. Broad strokes covering the main characters. Tell me the story of the Pentateuch in a paragraph of 8 to 12 sentences. Again, a little bit less, a little bit more. Don't worry about it. But be sure to cover the main parts. Genesis 1-3, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Exodus. What's the main problem? And again, that original intention of God being present with his people in a place, and how does God work to get that back? So what you'll do, start your journal entry. You kind of see mine here, just post your response below. But you'll post your responses there. And this does get graded. And so again, it's part of your participation for today. So again, not overly difficult, and you guys will have plenty of time to work on this. So you guys have 20 minutes to work on this, and then we'll chop it up and talk about it, be about it. So All right.
Means
Mm-hmm.
or the fall.
Yep. And what happens as a result of that?
Sin enters the world and they get kicked out of the garden.
Good. Good. And how what does sin do to relationships? Why is it such a problem?
Because it breaks relationships.
Mm-hmm. Relationships between who?
God and man.
God and man. Yep. And who else? Destruction. Yeah. But destruction of what, Estella?
Um, like of the relationship, because that's kind of one of the, for me, the way that I'm seeing it is
Mm.
like God's dealing with humanity and its destruction, because we're literally just, we've seen it through the Bible and we see it now.
Yeah.
We just naturally like cause problems for ourselves, and we
Yeah.
saw it in the Bible. Like when they were going through the through the desert, they were like, oh, we're gonna build this calf and we're gonna worship it because God is not doing this and that. Like, the moments that we don't see God or we go through a little trouble,
Mm-hmm.
we decide to turn our heads and focus on something else.
Yeah.
So for me, I see that as personal destruction. And
Yeah.
and for me, I personally saw a lot of that through what we've been reading. Our own like mindset, our own things that we do. And I say we because I don't know I don't know why I say we, but in the
Yeah.
Bible,
Humanity.
yeah, humanity in general.
Yeah, and exactly. And I think one of the things you're making the connection between is that it's not just a specific individual back then, but it's still currently an issue with humans that have this thing about especially with trusting God. And we had talked about one of the issues that comes up with sin, and it'll probably, hopefully the light bulb will go off, is this issue with autonomy. Autonomy becomes an issue. There's this desire to want to rule oneself and do whatever you want. And Hyman, you nailed it. That relationships with each other and with creation. That sin causes this kind of breach, this rupture in relationship with us and with God and with us with one another and then us with creation. And then again, you see that with this kind of change in relationship between God and humanity, where humanity now covers themselves up instead of living free and exposed to God and one another, that instead we become ashamed and we hide ourselves and we clothe ourselves with things from God and from one another. And then we see what happens with Cain and Abel, with the kind of anger that's now and the kind of brokenness that's now part of the world. And then how in Genesis 6 with the flood, it's everywhere. And a kind of brokenness in relationship between God and humanity, or between humanity and the earth itself. But how does God go about addressing the issue? What does God do in addressing this problem of sin having affected relationships between God and humanity, humanity with one another, and then humanity in the earth?
He
Um,
chooses Abraham to be the start of reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. Well, even before that, what happens?
he forgives. He offers grace.
He forgives and he offers grace. Yep.
Yeah. Even though, like, for example, the Noah covenant, um,
Mm-hmm.
he destroyed the world. But like after he was like, you know what? Never mind. Let me give you some grace and some love, and like through this covenant, I'm gonna promise that you're never gonna be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of see that way.
All right, good. Yeah, so God restarts humanity with Noah, and then after that, God's going to then kind of restart again with Abraham, and then kind of go from there. Um, but what does God create with Abraham that helps to address this problem? There's a specific word I'm looking for.
Covenant.
Hey, there you go, Christian. Covenant. Covenant, that God utilizes the means of covenant with Abraham, Moses, and then after the Exodus event. And about, again, going back to Abrahamic covenant, that promise of people, descendants, the promise of a place in Canaan, and the promise of God being present with the people to recover this original intention of God being present with the people. God being present with the people. And so much of the recovery of that exercise sets us up for what happens in Leviticus. And again, if we don't have that understanding in Leviticus, we'll dry out really quick, really quick. It's going to dry out just on its own because of what it's talking about. But again, we have to start there at the beginning of not only what was lost and what changed, but also how God is working to recover this original image, this original vision. So some technical elements about Leviticus, that the original name in Hebrew, Vayikra, and he summoned. This is again specifically a priestly set of texts, and that vav consecutive. That's just the vav. It's carried over from Hebrew, means and. Suggests a continuation from Exodus, that this isn't its own book left on its own, but has to be taken within the context of God just having delivered the Hebrews from Egypt. So again, another important element to remember as we had just finished talking about tabernacle, God being present with the people. But even Exodus begins with Vaele, which starts out, which again shows a continuation from Genesis. These stories are tied together. These stories are tied together, that they cannot be just pulled apart and decontextualized, but we have to see it as one big giant story that is being brought together of what God is doing to recover that original vision of what you have in Genesis 1 and 2 of God being present with the people in a place. So the setting for Leviticus is Mount Sinai. Again, the gathering place between God and people. And about a year after Israel departs from Egypt. About a year out. And so the authorship, we'll talk about a little bit here, is Moses and others. While not necessarily, it doesn't change our understanding of the book and its significance. But that what we do need to know is that the authors are primarily concerned with preserving priestly legacy. Again, these kind of details that are embedded within the text. That you have priestly texts and narratives woven together. And then for us to remember that Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers will have a lot of the same content. It's a part of this kind of threefold narrative, which also includes Genesis, as I mentioned before. So Leviticus itself does have 6 major sections. You have the first 7 chapters, sacrifice and worship. A couple of chapters, you have dedication of the temple and priests. Well, maybe we'll get there, maybe we won't. Ritual purity, chapters 11 and 15. You have regulations for the Day of Atonement. And we'll spend an extended time there at Day of Atonement just because there's lots there for us to understand as God's people today of what's happening with atonement and some significance for that, for our understanding of not only Jesus, but the sacrificial system and the language of atonement that Paul picks up in his letters. Holiness Code, chapter 17 to 26, and then laws on tithes and offering in chapter 27. So again, we have to understand Leviticus as a subset of what's happening at Tabernacle, of God meeting with the people. That we have to understand Leviticus as a subset of Tabernacle, of God meeting with the people. So what Yahweh is delivering to the people is a kind of a handbook, if you want to call it a manual, a guide for how the people are to live in relationship with him. Again, fulfilling his obligation of being present with the people. Yes, they aren't in the land yet, but there's a lot of descendants, and God is with the people. So at least 2 out of 3. We're at 66%. We're about to hit 100 here when we get to the promised land. And so again, part of the fulfillment that God makes with Abraham and being with the people. This is how that is not just made possible, but this is how this is continuing to be an ongoing relationship between God and the people. But in order to understand the maintenance of the relationship, we also need to understand sin. And I had mentioned at the start of this class, because I'm sure everybody remembers when I had mentioned it, that sin, in the way we understand it, has layers. To quote the philosopher Shrek, it's like an onion. It has layers to it. And so a few definitions that we need to understand, especially when church likes to simplify things, which isn't bad, but it can be overly simplistic, especially when we look at the different ways in which sin is addressed in the Bible, that it's not just one word. You have chata, which means to sin or do wrong, to bear blame, be guilty, infraction of law. And again, a lot of this has to do more with legal contexts. This can also refer to missing the mark, which refers to slingers hitting a target. When you chuck a rock and try to hit a target. The problem with missing the mark in its technical definition is the fact that it doesn't have a moral dimension, which sin does, because again, it comes within the context of covenant. It comes within the context of covenant. So it carries with this kind of moral weight to it that it's not just, oops, missed it. But no, rather, there was a specific standard to have been reached, and that was missed. There was a specific standard to have reached. There was a mark to have reached, but missed it. So again, there's a kind of moral element to this missing the mark. You have Pesa. Again, rebellion against a king. It's a judicial, political word. Also indicative of a rupture of relationship. Rupture of relationship. You have awon, which refers to something that's crooked, perverse. It's also the word that is used for iniquity. And some of these words have kind of illustrations that go along with them. And what awon is indicative of is that there's one that serves as a kind of standard, but when you put it right next to it, it's something that's either been bent or twisted, but doesn't align to the certain and specific standard that was meant to have been initially created. And so again, that there's a kind of bent or twisting while laying next to a standard. Again, there's something that's of an expectation, but that expectation is not met. It's veered off from. And sin's also referred to as a kind of blemish. And this most refers to a physical, ritual purity and uncleanness. It also can refer to contracting a disease. You'll see in the prophets where there's a link between sin and a disease, or being forgiven of one's sins and the experience of healing. And that's where this comes from. That's where this comes from. It's not so much, hey, you have sin, therefore you got sick, as much as it is the illustration of sin being a kind of sickness. Sin being a kind of sickness on its own. Not bringing on physical ailments itself, but rather being an ailment in and of itself. Sin is also referred to as a burden, that one can bear the load of guilt, punishment, or both. And again, indicative that sin is heavy, that causes a burden on the relationship and must be dealt with. That sin is heavy and causes a burden on the relationship which must be dealt with. And then swerving from the path. That's turning aside or in leaving a path. And again, in a moral sense, it's one who swerves from Yahweh's path. Again, you'll see this come up a lot in the Proverbs. You'll see this come up a lot in the Proverbs. And so again, you'll see these different, taking a look at the context in which sin is found. Hopefully you guys see the different layers to why I keep using these different words like disloyalty, unfaithfulness, rebellion. I don't necessarily use these words so much, like crooked, perverse, iniquity. I don't necessarily use those words, but I mean, again, you see why all these different images are kind of circling the relative element between God and humanity, humanity with one another, and humanity with the earth. And so, fun fact, sir. So there's a long chata to describe what really happens in Exodus 32 in the golden calf. And that Israel turns aside from the way that God had commanded. Israel turned aside from the way that God had commanded. And again, this is why I bring up law not just as some kind of legal code, but as a teaching. There's a teaching that is meant to serve as a kind of guide. But yet what Israel chooses to do is to swerve from the way God has provided in this teaching, essentially to get off of God's track and to stay from the good path. And I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to go over these. There's a couple things that we need to think about, especially for sacrifices in response to sin. And the main one that we need to underline, especially as we think about relationship with God and we think through the implications of a relationship with Jesus and what Jesus provides, is that sacrifices help to maintain the relationship that was built on covenants. Sacrifices help to maintain the relationship that was built on covenants. Note that the sacrifices themselves are not the relationship. Sacrifices themselves are not the relationship, but rather the means of preserving and repairing the relationship, but are not the relationship themselves. Meaning, participating in these sacrifices was not the only way that Israel was involved in the relationship with Yahweh, which has a lot of implications for us and how we perceive the activities of our worship, mainly in our singing and our church's attendance, and how that alone is deficient to be the only thing that is involved in our relationship with Jesus. Again, the ways in which Israel maintained their relationship with God was through sacrifices, not just sacrifices on their own. It was God's initiated covenant and that continual of coming of God to the people that both initiated and carried out the relationship. And again, that's really important for us to recognize, because if we miss it, again, we'll end up regressing into just saying, well, Judaism is just purely legalistic, without these kinds of signs of grace that God has provided in and through the sacrificial system. And again, if we fail to understand this part, it has definite implications on the way in which we understand our relationship to Jesus and what Jesus does. That Jesus comes not just to hold back God's wrath from being poured out on every one of us, but rather, again, to breach the relationship that had been made between humanity and God. Specifically starting with Israel, but now being extended throughout the whole world. And that you and I have the opportunity to be a part of this people through that repaired relationship that Jesus provides. Anyway, go back to the Old Testament. That sacrifices and offerings provide a means of approaching the Lord in his place. Again, the Yahweh provides the means of approaching him. It's not just make it up as you go or figure it out. Figure it out, but Yahweh provides the means. Now, the English term offering refers to the presentation of a gift, and the broader term sacrifice refers to something, the making of something sacred, and we need to have these terms pulled apart. We need to have these terms pulled apart. Again, offering refers to a gift. Sacrifices refers to making something sacred, setting it apart as the response. So then sacrifice and covenant. But again, to remember, at least at this point, the two covenants, well, three covenants considering Noahic, but the two big ones on which the sacrifices and these feasts and these systems will fall back on is Abrahamic and Mosaic, Sinai and Abrahamic. That the covenant at Sinai spells out the kind of nation, the kind of people the Yahweh intends Israel to be, which affords them certain privileges. It affords them certain privileges of being God's people, of being this chosen nation, this kingdom of kings and priests, queens and priestesses. But then also carries with it a certain responsibility, which is demonstrated in the sacrificial system. Again, Israel has a certain privilege with being God's people, but then also bears the weight of certain responsibility demonstrated in the sacrificial system. That having Yahweh as their God entails a kind of conformity to his character of being his reflection in the world, which I had brought up before, is part of our vocation as human beings, being made in God's image to reflect God in and to the world. That the Sinai covenant is concerned not just with the maintenance of rules, but how to be and stay Yahweh's people. The Sinai covenant isn't just concerned with regulating rules and behaviors, but with how to be Yahweh's people, reflecting his character in the world. And that the sacrificial system helps God's people stay his people. So if Sinai is concerned with how to be God's people, sacrificial systems helps God's people stay his people. That is, stay in relationship with Yahweh. The maintenance of relationship. Okay, so are there any thoughts, questions, comments before we move on? Thoughts, questions, comments? I want to give you guys at least a little bit of a break to kind of think it through.
So the covenant is like something, it's Old Testament though. It's totally different with New Testament, like context type stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's some overlap for us to be paying attention to, but more specifically, again, with us understanding the nature of God's character, of what Jesus demonstrates about God that was already there in the Old Testament. But again, we're usually inclined to read this as kind of an old book of rules. But it's always been consistent with God's character to be concerned not just with having people as his own, but then also ensuring that there's a means of God and the people to remain in relationship. And so, again, that being said, that it shouldn't come as a surprise to us, even though it often does, that God goes to the nth degree to make sure that, like, people are taken care of and people are in relationship with himself. And there are certain times when Yahweh seems to respond harshly, like we'll see with the priest, but those things don't come without specific warnings. Which again, those are reflected within the New Testament as well. So you're welcome. And yeah, again, so much of what Jesus does, both when Jesus says that I haven't come to abolish the law but to fulfill it, to fill it out, doesn't mean that Jesus is doing away with all these things, but rather coming to fulfill their full, I don't want to say implication or designation, but to give a kind of finality to these kinds of things that were shadows, as Paul describes them, of things to come. But if we don't understand their first significance, then it's going to be difficult to understand the second significance of how Jesus comes to reframe so much of this. And why for Paul, Jesus, and you'll notice it from your Galatian studies, how for Paul, Jesus is the end of the law. And how Jesus comes to fulfill so many of these requirements that he does, and that we become beneficiaries and heirs to Abraham, children of Abraham, by way of belief in Messiah, Jesus. But again, seeing here God's specific relational intention, that it becomes very difficult. It becomes very easy, in fact, to purely spiritualize certain texts and thinking that they're only these are only New Testament ideas or concepts. And then by that point, just the Old Testament becomes a kind of, we don't really need it. And so let me go ahead. We won't go through Day of Atonement, and because you guys already went through talking about offerings, I'm gonna go through them in passing. And I don't know what's going on with my head. I'm getting a nasty headache and starting to not feel well. So we'll go through this pretty quick. So again, what the sacrificial system is meant to do is to help maintain the relationship between Yahweh and the people. This may or may not come up in a quiz, just as a heads up. The intention of the sacrificial system is to maintain the relationship between Yahweh and Israel. It's not to create the relationship. It's not the relationship in and of itself, but rather to maintain the relationship between Yahweh and the people. And so you'll see the list of sacrifices there: burnt offering, grain offering, peace offering, purification offering, and reparation offering, which also on this side, a little bit different for the priests: burnt offering, grain offering, purification offering, reparation offering, and peace offering. You'll see them in different orders, but they'll be the same thing on both sides. And so Leviticus, again, you guys did this for your assignment, so I won't belabor it too much. The burnt offering is the best of the animals is expected. But again, here you have, although the expectation is for a firstborn male without defect, you do have some allowance made for those who are poor and able to offer maybe a dove or a young pigeon. And so the burnt offering is given with a whole animal. And this kind of aroma pleasing to the Lord, that it's intended to gain divine favor, that the gods are satisfied. It's taken from the ancient Near East, where the gods are satisfied by the smell of sacrifices. And that's kind of what gets carried over in the Hebrew Bible as well. Grain offering. This is the only offering that doesn't involve animals. And again, similar to a burnt offering intended to make Yahweh happy. And this doesn't just mean, and that's not taken as a kind of a belittling of the word or to make it elementary, but really the word in Hebrew, that's kind of what it's meant, that it makes Yahweh glad or happy. And only a portion is burnt, and some of the grain offering is given over to the priests for their specific and special service. It's only part of the grain offering that's given to them. And the peace offering. You'll see it doesn't involve the whole animal. Certain portions set apart for God, the fat and liver and the kidneys on the altar. The right leg goes to the officiating priest. Some are given to other priests, but this is sometimes called a fellowship offering. And it always involved a meal. But what this also can be referred to as the shalom offering. And again, you have a meal that is shared between the priests and God is indicative of a relationship that has been restored. You call it good and then you break bread. Because you know your relationship's all right if you can sit at the table, eat, talk, hang out. Again, this recovering this original vision of God being present with his people. And fun fact, Jesus spends a lot of time eating with people. And was one of the things he does after resurrection? Eats. Chills and eats. Something that going on. So offering purification offerings. There's an emphasis on the blood used to cleanse sacred items within the tabernacle. And you'll have this kind of threefold phrase to expiate, cleanse, or atone items from sin. Again, there's this idea we brought up with the idea of sin, that it causes blemish or pollution. And what this purification offering is meant to do is to cleanse items and or individuals from the blemishes brought on by sin. What the purification offering is meant to do is to provide cleanliness, reparation for the blemish brought on by sin. And then reparation, he uses a ram. And then what is intended to be communicated to God is it serves as a kind of reparation to compensate for wrongs committed against him. For wrongs committed against him. Again, this takes up that kind of rebellion element within sin. And that's why I brought up those multi-layers to sin, because the fact that this is what's going on. But if we don't see the multivalent kind of layers to sin, then all these offerings are just kind of like, why do they keep repeating the same thing over and over again? They just had to do it once. And even more so when we get to Jesus, well, why don't they just say Jesus just died for sin? And why does it have to be so complicated? But this is why. Because all the layers that happen in regards to how we understand sin and the kind of rupture in relationship of what it signifies between us and God, us and one another, and us and to creation. Are there any questions so far? Questions, comments, concerns? All right. Well, we'll go ahead and end class for today. I'm starting to kind of see doubles, so that's not good. But yeah, so if you guys have any questions, comments, please feel free to email me anytime. Again, office hours this week, 2 to 4. We'll continue to go through this. I wasn't able to get through all of it. We'll pick it back up again next week. And then as we talk about sacrifices. But again, the big thing is for us to remember is all this comes as a result of God's desire to want to be present with the people. And how are the people going to respond in maintenance of the relationship between themselves and God? That God's initiated relationship, God's come close, and now what's being demanded is this kind of responsible participation on the side of God's people. That God's inviting his people to respond appropriately, and this is how he's doing it. Invitation and participation. It's part of God's MO in the Old Testament. It'll come up again in the New Testament with the New Covenant. And so much of what Jesus' teachings do for us and to us, that it's meant to involve participation, which then becomes our worship. And so, All right. Well, do you guys have any questions, comments, thoughts? All right. Well, you guys have an absolutely awesome week. Again, if you guys have any questions, I'll 2 to 4 on Tuesday, Thursday. If not, we'll see you guys next week. Thank you, Taylor.
Thank
Appreciate it.
you.